Hello and welcome to The Content Bite, a podcast for freelancers who use their words to make money. I'm Rachel Smith, a freelance journalist, copywriter and content producer. I'm also the founder of Rachel's List, a jobs board and community for Australian writers and other creatives.
And I'm Lynne Testoni. I'm a journalist and content writer as well. Rachel and I are your weekly co-hosts, and every week we bring you all kinds of tips, tricks and some fabulous guests to help you make the most of your freelance business.
Many writers don't realise just how much their time is really worth, and we waste a lot of time doing things that can be automated. That's why I love Rounded. It tracks invoices so I don't have to remember who's paid and who needs chasing up. And when I started using Rounded, I realised how much time I'd been wasting on admin, literally hours every week. Now it takes me about 2 minutes to send an invoice.
Yeah, and it's worth knowing that you can try Rounded for free. And if you're a gold member of Rachel's List, you're in luck. You can save 20% on any annual Rounded plan.
Hey Lynne, it's been a while since the summit. We're still getting some lovely comments about it though, aren't we?
Oh, we are. And it still blows me away when someone does a summit review on LinkedIn and everybody's asking us about Summit 2.0.
We haven't said, yay or nay yet. I just say we'll see when people ask me about it. Yeah, we might talk about that a bit more in upcoming episodes. But today we're delving a bit more into a topic that we touched on during the final panel of day 2 of the summit. And if you were there, you'll remember it. It was the different ways you can diversify your income. And today we're going to dive into podcasting, whether that's doing your own podcast or working on branded podcasts.
Yeah, it's such an interesting topic, actually.
Particularly for us.
Well, we love podcasts, but I think the branded podcast is a really interesting opportunity for a lot of freelancers. So
Absolutely.
We really wanted to hear more from Kim Kerton, who was a fabulous panelist on that last panel.
She was.
And she's so much experience in the podcasting world and lots of cool stuff to share with us.
Absolutely. Well, how about you introduce her and then we'll get her into the hot seat?
Fantastic. I will. Love to. Kim Kerton is host, creator and producer of the popular small business podcast, Unemployed and Afraid, a weekly podcast for the ones who've made the brave decision to employ themselves, where she dives headfirst into the good, the bad and the messy journey of starting and building a business. She's also a creative and commercially minded branded podcast strategist, helping brands build themselves big podcasts, plus a writer, speaker, sometimes ceramicist. Oh,
Yay.
That's you, Rach.
We have talked about that.
And a park mum.
Yay.
Before all that, Kim was a baby entrepreneur, creating and closing 2 businesses before the age of 21, which is so interesting, and then spent over a decade in the commercial radio business in branded content, sales and leadership. She walked away from her career to create something else, her own thing, got unemployed and afraid, and here we are. She's worked with brands such as Squarespace, Queensland Tourism, Vodafone and more. She was a recent Rising Star finalist in the Australian Podcast Awards. Welcome, Kim.
Wow, thank you so much for having me. It's so funny being on the other side of an intro. I can see how my guests feel nervous and awkward now too.
They're very nervous and afraid. No. Well, look, as we were saying before, and we were saying sort of off air as well, we really loved hearing your perspectives on podcasting at the summit. And we instantly knew we wanted to hear more. We know as well from the feedback that other people did too. So we're really glad that you're here. And I think there's this growing appetite for podcasting and the audio evolution generally. I do all the things on the Content Bite, like I do little snippets and find stats and things that are happening. And I think it's really interesting what's happening out there with podcasting.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The medium is growing up, I guess. It is over 15 years old-ish now, if we think back to the really early stages. But it's the industry around it, I think, that's really started to grow up. And I think a lot of that is about podcasts' accessibility. I mean, it's so accessible for us as creators. There's no real gatekeepers like they have in, publishing and all the major medium, commercial radio, TV. It's kind of in par with that, or on par with that creator economy and that evolution where we can grow and we can create our own audiences, monetize those audiences and really do our own thing. So yeah, it's a very special medium, very close to my heart, obviously, but I think a really powerful one too.
I think so. So I'm so keen to dive in, but before we do, let's wind back the clock a little and start with your background, because I'd love to know about those 2 businesses you started when you were 21.
Oh Lord, well, they are quite the memory. I left school at 15, so I dropped the school books as quickly as I could. I think my parents knew that they just had no chance. I'm a very headstrong individual, and I hated school. I hated being told what to do. I loved learning, but I just hated being told what to do. And so 15, as early as I could, I dropped out and started working straight away. So I took a full-time role at the place that I did work experience at. Remember work experience?
Yes.
In a little cafe, and just started to see the feeling of earning my own money and kind of growing my own world, my own financial world. But through that period, I studied remedial massage therapy. That's something that took my interest. So I went and I learned how to do it. That led me into beauty therapy. So, I think nails, the old acrylic nails, remember the old long ones?
Oh, yeah.
Glitter tips. Oh, really hot stuff. Spray tanning, waxing, all of the good stuff. And I loved that. I loved working with people. I loved the creative side of that. And I was working at a salon that was owned by my teacher at that stage. And I was one of her, I guess you'd call me a consultant. I was sort of renting a chair there, and she had decided to sell it. And I was heartbroken because I felt like I'd found my little place in the world. I was like, no, I don't want this to go anywhere. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? And she said, well, I'll sell it to you for $5,000 if you want it. And we're talking taking on a lease, the products that were in there. And then, of course, there was all other people hiring chairs as well. So there wasn't like staff costs or, exorbitant overheads. But $5,000 at, I think I was 19 at that stage was still quite a lot of money. It was basically all I had. So I remember calling my parents and telling them about this plan I had. They were away for the weekend. And they said, whatever you do, just wait till we get home. Don't do anything until we get home. And guess what I did?
You bought the business.
I bought the business, yes. And I did not know what that meant at the time, but I bought the business. And yeah, they were furious to say the least. But they were business owners as well. I'd always seen entrepreneurialism in the house and, working for yourself. So I guess maybe deep down, I didn't realize at the time, because what 19-year-old will admit this, but I wanted to be like mum and dad. But yeah, threw myself into that. And that was, I don't know if we can swear on this podcast, so I won't say it, but a complete F up in short.
The things you don't know.
Things you don't know.
About the business part of it, I'm sure you knew quite a bit about dealing with customers and the actual service, but the business part is a big learning curve, isn't it?
Oh, I had no idea. I had no idea about marketing. I would have, remember in the old days, people from like the Yellow Pages and the local newspaper would come and talk to you and tell you about these amazing things that are going to bring in so much customers, reach so many customers, reach so many people. And so I would go and I'd spend, $500, $700, $1,000 on these things, thinking I was going to get customers coming through. And of course that went nowhere. So, bit by bit, I was struggling and had a really challenging experience with that, where it was, in the days where we didn't have a computer system, we had client cards, with all their details on there. And there was a bit of a disagreement in the people that owned it previously. And one of the people that worked there said the clients were hers, that many of the clients were hers. So she came and physically took the client cards off the premises. And, as a young girl, I didn't know how to say no. I was intimidated. And so, I just felt like the world was against me in this. And I was learning very hard and fast. And it was too much. And I had taken on too much. And I had to make that call and say, no, this isn't right. So at the end of the lease period, I just let it shut down and took my little group of clients and serviced them from home as best I could with nails and things like that, and just kind of tried to lick my wounds and see how I could build into something else. So that was the business one.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
What was number 2?
The second one, I actually ended up in radio. A few jobs later, I went into events. I was working for a promotional modeling agency, and I was helping them with their events and their booking of staff. And then I went into working for a community radio station, which was fantastic. And then I went into my first commercial radio job. I loved that. It was in promotions and marketing. And then when I left that, I started my second business. And I decided I wanted to be a personal shopper. So of all things, I swear I was just making businesses up for the stuff I like to do at this age.
Yes.
I don't
It's
think
ridiculous.
that's unusual.
But I thought, there's a real niche for this, busy people in cities, needing someone to buy presents and gifts for friends and family on their behalf. So that sort of level of, personal and professional gifting as a shopping service. So I tried to get that up and running, built a website and, threw myself out of a well-paying job into this. Oh, I've got this is going to be fantastic. And, 6 months later, I realized that again was a huge mistake. And mostly because I really don't think I understood at that stage just how challenging it is to get any new idea out there. And, you can have the best idea in the world, but how you get it out there, how you communicate your offering, the guts you have to communicate your offering far and wide and put yourself out there for rejection. I just wasn't ready. So yeah, back into corporate world for me. And I think I lost about another 10 years.
Wow. That was sort of your commercial radio years, wasn't it? Yeah. Was that a really good grounding into, going into branded podcast strategy, or did you just leave thinking there's actually way more I need to know?
It's a bit of both, actually, Rachel. I mean, I think commercial radio did so much for my understanding of the audio medium. Now, I wasn't on radio, I was behind the scenes. So I started in sales and I serviced large agencies. So I looked after big clients, NAB, Ford, Cbus, Vodafone, a lot of fantastic clients. And actually, Vodafone I worked on later. But anyway, side note. But I worked on some big clients. And what I really loved about that role was selling integrated solutions. And so, they were well and beyond spots and dots and just putting ads on the radio. It was about finding ways to integrate with the radio environment to really get a message across, partner with talent, create events, create your own kind of little integrated segment within a bigger segment of the show that was, in breakfast. And I just loved that aspect of it. So it gave me a deeper understanding, I think, than I would have had if I was just dealing more so in the transactional sales side of things. And I got to deal with talent a lot, which was, fantastic learning of the craft. And that took me into a branded content role. And that's when I moved up to Sydney, and we had a division in the network that I worked for I worked for Nova Entertainment, and they had a division called Create. And Create was essentially the team that created ideas for brands, from idea and insight, strategy behind it, right through to execution, analytics, creative writing, everything. So I was privileged enough to lead that team in Sydney, and that gave me a rich insight. And at that time, podcasting was here and it was happening. There was what would you call it? I guess you would say there was a podcast platform within the Nova Entertainment family at that time in Acast, who were just fantastic. And so I got to see a little bit of the inside and the building of podcasting in that space, but I was sort of one part removed. We were creating ideas for clients for podcasts through that stage. Not all of them would sell. It wouldn't be the right thing for every client, but I was getting a feel for the platform or the medium. But what I've gained since being a creator is far beyond. I mean, now I realize how much of a hole I had in my understanding for the person delivering a piece of branded content or creating a show, editing a show, really thinking about communicating to the audience. I mean, that was a huge learning curve for me. But yes, to answer your question directly, it gave me a fantastic grounding.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So that sort of leads me into the next question. So what does a branded podcast strategist do? So I guess what has taken all those learnings, and talk us through your typical week, and because we know you have a few clients, so tell us how it all works.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think, the best start point is the difference between a creator-led podcast and a brand-led podcast.
Yep.
And, I run a creator-led podcast. We're talking on one here right now. You guys are creator-led podcast hosts creating an incredible podcast. And that means you get to have, that kind of control over the audience, and you own the audience, and you're able to share what they need and be really connected to the product, monetize it in your own way. So, and use your own audience. When you're doing it from a branded voice, it is different, but exactly the same. So you have to think of it as you don't necessarily have the same right to say, hi, I'm Palmolive and I'm doing a podcast. It doesn't make the same sort of sense, but you still need to serve an audience. But from the brand side and the brand's perspective, they then get to own the environment. So rather than as a creator-led podcast where you might monetize to other clients and you might build your audience and you might sell them into your products, for a brand, it's about really connecting with an audience on something that they want. their audience to feel like they're supporting them on. So, a best example is a recent podcast that was created for Queensland. And now Queensland Tourism have a huge passion of supporting accessibility in tourism. And so rather than Queensland going on and saying, we are an accessible destination and come and visit us and here is why, what they actually did was create a branded podcast environment where we created the strategy behind it, which was you really want to learn from people who have traveled with a disability. If you're somebody with a disability or caring for someone with a disability, true stories are really important, and stories from the source are really important. And, when it comes to, I guess that kind of toxic, show, don't tell, not really embedded in realism. Like we can sniff it out, right? We can sniff out tokenism really, really easy. So it can't be that. It has to be real. And so then they crafted the right hosts and the right content and the right message to get that message across that they really care about accessible tourism in a very authentic way. And it gives them the ability to promote their destination in an authentic way. So, they can then control that environment. They can put ads in about themselves if they want. They can partner with others they want to be a part of. I mean, that's just one example of a way to do a branded podcast. But more specifically, my role as a strategist in that is I look for that opportunity for a brand to tell a story that's bigger than themselves in order to create an environment that's going to convert into something meaningful for them as a business. So I might work with a client and, really understand who they want to talk to and how they want to serve them. How do you want them to feel? Do you want to reach new people, or do you want to really over service the people that you have to build brand affinity? And then what do you want to talk about? So not necessarily does a skincare brand need to talk about skincare. It can be something adjacent to that makes a lot of sense for their audience specifically, that we can then build a show around, which creates a wonderful and a natural environment for them to have their message included within. So that's kind of what I do as a brand and podcast strategist, is find that happy place between an audience and a brand and what we should create together. And then I go deeper in creating the episode architecture, the show architecture overall, what it sounds like, the tone of voice, the energy behind the show, how you might market it. And within that, there's a lot of variables, but it all comes back to that high level of what does an audience need and how do they want to be served, and what cultural insights do we have to back that up. I talked before about being able to sniff out tokenism really easily. That's a high level cultural insight. Like we know now that tokenism will get called out like that. And so you cannot do that. So realism in storytelling from a brand is absolutely key. And so that's, a cultural insight we can start to leverage off of. Okay, how do we now then do what you want to do in terms of your brand and develop it out from there? Now, I've digressed because you can tell I'm very passionate about branded podcasting.
I've got so many questions. I keep thinking of more. But anyway, keep going.
Oh, this is what happens when you get 3 podcasters on a podcast. But so what does my week look like? I'm lucky enough to work with some fantastic production houses. So I work with the Peers Project, have been working for them for a very long time. And I'm working with some other production agencies as well. And so I help them. I come in and they might say, I've got this great brand. I want that wants to work on a podcast. Can you help come in and understand their why, find the cultural insight and start to build a concept for them that's going to resonate and it's going to work with an audience and work from a marketing perspective as well. So I will consult or freelance in that way. Working with them. And like you mentioned, I'm also creating a course that helps small businesses do this, because enterprise thinking should be given to small businesses. Like we deserve the world. We're the hardest working people on the planet. So I have that offering as well. I'll work one-to-one with brands without a production agency to help them get set up, or I'll come in and I'll workshop with a team. Maybe there's a marketing team that has been tasked by their CEO or the CMO to say, we're going to create a podcast, guys. And so I can come in and spend a day with them and teach them all about the landscape of podcasts and the audience and, the why behind you might do some of this and the metrics behind it, all of those things. So very varied.
That's so interesting. I kept thinking as you were talking, a lot of it reminded me of like content marketing, that we do, where you're sort of educating and informing as this adjacent thing to what the brand is trying to do. Like they're trying to convert those readers in a softly way, but they're not doing that hard sell like you sometimes get with copywriting. So that's quite interesting hearing about it from the audio side of things and how you put all that together. But the other thing I wanted to ask is, that process of where you're building the episode architecture and looking at, how the podcast might work and finding, say, a host or whatever, how long does that process generally take?
I think clients would like it to take about a week.
But
Yes.
yeah, I'm sure everyone listening gets that.
Yes.
But look, that could and should take upwards of 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks to really nail it. I think I see a lot of brands come in with an idea already forming. But then it's just about, how do we really make that work? Because, marketers, we all get stuck in our marketing bubble. Like, this is going to be great. But you have to, exactly as you said, think content first, get in the head of your audience and really work back from there. What are they going to like? Because building, there's a lot of different ways to do a branded podcast. You can do one that's heavily consumer targeted, like the one that I mentioned before for Queensland. And it's, about building a big podcast brand or a big podcast audience. And that requires consistency, like years and years of consistency, doing an episode, committing to your schedule once a week, twice a week, whatever it is, committing to it, promoting the darn thing. Like, you actually can't put a podcast into the ether and expect it to just thrive. But it could also be a B2B podcast. It could be a smaller level. And maybe your metric of success is being able to secure relationships with people at like businesses to be able to convert into clients. And so, look, it does depend generally on what you want to achieve, how big it is. If it's a consumer level podcast, we need to spend the time. It should be a couple of months at least, really working out down to the fine detail what it's going to be and how we're going to promote the thing and how we're going to make it thrive. Or, we could do an internal, maybe it's a podcast that's just for your internal team.
We talked to a girl near you about that, didn't we? She talked about
the
rise in internal podcasts and how that's another way to really engage staff, and deliver information that they need to know, but they might not necessarily want to read on an intranet or whatever.
Such a good way, because who doesn't love, whacking on headphones and going for a walk to learn something from your employer rather than sit.
Or when staff are on the road a bit, like we'd sort of, when you've got staff who are listening to podcasts when they're in cars or trucks or whatever. I thought that was really interesting.
And all of those things need people, you know what I mean? But I'm interested as well, because you mentioned, you'll sometimes go in for a day to work on a project and say, here's how, the podcasting landscape works. Here's what you guys need to do. Here are some ideas. And then that's the end of it. But I imagine you're also, say, with a Queensland type podcast, there for the duration. I mean, and helping with that consistency. Would you sometimes be working with a client like that for a very long time and looking at the metrics and tweaking for them? How does all that work? When are you done, and walking away from that job or that project?
It's a great question. And it depends how and who I'm working with. So that podcast with Queensland was produced by the Peers Project. So I acted as their strategy director on that project. And so I did stay all the way through, because we've only just wrapped that up. So that was it's been a good 12 months from inception, right the way through to execution. So, as a strategist, naturally my role comes in the early days, very, very heavy. So it's, all about the fine details and kind of getting their map and their plan together. But there is, at that stage, once you've got a plan and you kind of know what you're doing, at that stage, it's very possible that a strategist can go hands off and go, all right, over to you. But you then need to have a really, really queued up and fantastic producer on hand that's going to, really take that project through and look at those metrics in it. Or you could have someone like me who can also do that. Maybe I wouldn't play the role of producer, because that might require someone with different skills. But yes, I would see it for Queensland in particular. I saw that all the way through. And, we look at metrics and look at how is it performing? How is it performing based on the measures that we were hoping? How do people feel about the brand? And those measures of success are so important to get right up front, because otherwise you guys run a podcast, right? And I'm sure some of your listeners do too. You look at these numbers, you look at these metrics, you're like, what does this even mean? Am I successful? So you kind of have to set your benchmarks and be like, if I can impact 20 people this week with my podcast, that's a big win.
It's so fascinating. Wow. It really gives us a different kind of view of the kind of work that might be out there for creative people who, can
things
build
you
on
might
their
not
skills.
have considered.
For sure.
So your bio said you walked away from the career and got unemployed and afraid, which I love. So talk us through why. Well, obviously you've got this real entrepreneurial streak that you grew up with. Is that part of it?
Yeah, that is part of it, Lynne. I think in that role that I was in, I loved it. I had my very best friends working by my side. As anybody who's ever worked in the media will know, you're all a bunch of like-minded people, so it's really hard not to make friends. So, in that respect, I loved who I worked with, but I worked really, really hard to the point where, and this is I think a lot of people will relate to this, but I really made it my identity, what I did. And it's very easy to do in those sorts of environments. Where I worked was me. I talked about it at home. It was what I thought about on the weekends. I hung out with my workmates every, nonstop, and it was all consuming. And so I wouldn't use the term burnt out, but I would use the term overcooked.
Probably would be that. Unbalanced, maybe.
Yeah. And I just, I really started to question what about the role made me so happy and what I would be without it. And I couldn't answer that while I worked there. And, that's a big thing for anyone working in media, the volume of emails, the deadlines, the pressures, particularly when you're leading a team, particularly when you work for a passionate organization who wants to grow. You just don't have any headspace to think about it. You're exhausted at the end of the day. And I honestly just got to a point where I said, I actually remember the moment, because I was talking with a not a business consultant, because that's just, I've got my business brain on with that, but kind of like a professional coach, a professional coach that the business had organized for me, mind you. So very conscious of that. Sorry. But I was talking to her, and I was talking to her about the struggles I was happening. And I was starting to put a lot of, blame externally on my happiness, being like, I'd only be happy if this changed or this changed or this changed within the job. And, we sort of were talking one day, and I hung up from her and just said, I need to quit. And I got back on with her, and I was like, I need to quit. And she's like, okay, whoa. Probably she's like, I'm employed by your employer.
She was like, oh shit. This hasn't gone in the direction I hoped for.
Yeah, I have really fucked up this one. But, we had a good chat. About it. And she did say to me, not dissimilar to how my parents said to me when I was 19, considering that salon, just give it a few days.
Think about it over the weekend.
And of course you didn't, did you?
I didn't. I went in on the Monday. I think this happened on a Thursday. I think I pulled a sickie on the Friday, quite a genuine sickie. I felt very exhausted and overwhelmed with this decision, and went in on the Monday, and it was terrible timing. There was a lot going on in the business at the time.
It's never good timing.
Oh, I know, but you do regret these things, and it's hard. It's never right, but you can pick a time. I'm a very impatient human when I've got a feeling, but I went in and said I'm leaving, and went obviously down like a ton of bricks, and like, why? Where are you going? And I couldn't answer any of those questions. I had no idea. I just knew I had to stop, and I had to think about what it was that I wanted. I never ruled out going back to media in some way, shape or form, but I certainly didn't want it to be exactly like what I was doing. And I thought, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take 6 months, 8 months, however long I can make my money last. And I'm going to really find myself. I'm going to think about maybe a side hustle, and maybe I do like part-time media and part-time, who the bloody knows, side business. And, this grand idea that I was just going to get some headspace. And that was January 2020.
Yeah.
Wow.
Oops.
Excellent timing. Great timing. And so, when everything like that happened, when 2020 happened, I didn't have a choice. There wasn't any jobs. That I started frantically applying for roles, pretty soon thinking, gosh knows how long this is going to last for. I just need to get some income. And I couldn't get a job to save my life. And, that had never been something I'd encountered, with my level of experience. I didn't expect that. And it was just that everything I applied for would then disappear as recruiters pulled their heads in. And yeah, that was that. So I was quite genuinely unemployed and afraid. It wasn't at that point that I didn't know what I was going to do. And I just had to make it work from there. I tried a lot of things. The only thing I had planned when I left my media career was that I was going to do yoga teacher training, because I've always loved yoga, and it's something I would come back to when I just needed to like move the body and stretch and like think a little bit. And so I thought I'll do the teacher training, not to become a teacher, but to just have like a month of concentrated therapy, basically, which it was. A huge recommend to anyone who wishes to do that, as long as you don't mind crying in public repeatedly. But it was a wonderful experience. And I really found my ability to, speak in front of a room confidently again, because I think I'd lost a little bit of that. I was always such a confident presenter, but once I left, I felt like a shadow of my former self. I felt really broken. I didn't know who I was without this job, Yeah, so I ended up teaching yoga because that was the only thing I could do at that stage. So I taught yoga online for friends and family and whoever would hire me to teach for them through COVID. And then, moved myself to a very remote part of Australia where I could afford the rent and started playing with other ideas and getting entrepreneurial again. I started teaching yoga at high-end Airbnbs in a private setting. And I started, teaching a local class. I set up my own local class and my own brand, and then became a ceramicist, taught myself how to make ceramics, released a range of homewares, which was wildly successful. And I still get messages saying, can I have a dinner set? And I'm like, no, I've stopped. Why? Where were you a year ago?
Your stuff was amazing. I loved your ceramics.
I will make again. I will make again one day.
Yeah. Because I've realized that I don't want to be a ceramicist. I just want to buy other people's ceramics, and that's a really good realization. So obviously Unemployed and Afraid led to Unemployed and Afraid, the podcast, and you've done 100 episodes. I love how it's all about tackling the, quote, glorious mess of creating a business you love. What are some of the biggest things that you've learned from your guests over the time of doing it? The ones that have really stuck in your mind or perhaps inspired you to do something different with your own business?
Great question. There are, we could do another whole podcast on this, honestly.
I know.
There's
you might have to pick one or two.
I know. I'm thinking, oh gosh, I don't want to take all day here. But I think the reason I started it was because I felt like a lot of the conversations around business, particularly in Australia, are success stories talking to success stories. And they're kind of over the mountain, right? But when you're sat there trying to figure out what the hell you're going to do, and simple things like, what do I do with this accounting software? What is accounting? Like what is a P&L? What is, right through to what will I call my business? How will I market myself? What even is my business? There wasn't enough conversation around the things that I was experiencing, which is why I started it. And the biggest lesson I've learned is that every single person in business feels exactly the same way. We are all shitting ourselves on the daily, doing things that we are uncomfortable about, and learning to be confident in areas we have no confidence in, and learning such an abundance of new skills every day, from the platforms we use through to how we talk about ourselves, how we, manage things like big headlines like PR. Like what does that even mean? That means sending someone an email. That means figuring out who to send it to and how to write it. We're just all learning so much, and we're all in the same boat. And that for me has been revolutionary, because with more conversations like that, when we realize we can see ourselves in the stories of others, more of us will keep going. And that was my risk. I was listening to these success stories and I was like, oh, I am so far from this. And now my confidence is shot. And, we just weren't getting enough of the realness. And so, the fact that we're all shitting ourselves, and we're all just working it out has been the biggest lesson. And the other one is, our businesses will change 100 times at the least. And that is perfectly okay. You can rewrite your about me and your bio as many times as you want. You can take one brand name and make it 3 different things. Nobody cares. You just have to keep trying and keep pivoting and finding the thing that works for you.
That's so interesting that you say that, because I think a lot of people hold on to that initial idea and almost pretzel themselves into different directions to try and make that work. And so it's really important to put that idea out there that you can evolve, you can reinvent yourself. We've all done it. I mean, Lynne and I have done it in numerous ways over the years, So I love that. It's really important.
It is a really wonderful way. It's how you grow and keep interested. If you're doing the same thing over and over again, it's pretty boring.
We see that with a lot of journalists who've been kind of entrenched in-house for so long and doing things the same way, and then end up in the freelance world and almost are frozen or stuck. Do you feel that a bit, Lynne? Well, you see it more with your scone afternoons when you're helping.
When I had the redundancy scones. Yes. Well, people who've never, you get stuck in that sort of in-house thing, doing things the same way, and often in what we call legacy media. So print media or maybe even commercial radio might be similar, where they've been doing the same things within a shrinking audience with shrinking resources. And then, of course, by the time they leave, they don't know how to reinvent themselves and they're stuck into that whole scarcity mentality. Do you find
Or they
that
don't know
too?
how to be a business. They don't think they're a business. They don't actually have that mindset yet, because that you have to really consciously go, this is it. I am a business owner. Yeah.
Such a great point, that recognizing yourself as a business owner is a journey in and of itself, and backing yourself in that way. But our brains like things that are easy. That's just from an evolutionary perspective. It's how we're wired, is we like those easy pathways. So we can just show up and we kind of, a little bit of challenge, but we kind of know generally who we need to talk to about this, what we need to do to get that happening, who needs to approve that, how this deadline process, how this upload process works, right? Just thinking in terms of submitting any kind of work. We like that. And business and working for yourself and freelancing, sole trading, whether you're an enterprise, it's all business.
Yeah.
When you're working for yourself. And so treating yourself with that level of respect as well is learned, but it is also very challenging and very difficult. You're going to stretch yourselves in ways that are not comfortable to your brain in any way, shape or form. And it's exhausting. But it's so rewarding. On the other side, it's
you become unemployable because you become addicted to that,
Exactly.
It's exactly where I'm at. I think we're amongst friends.
I think we're all there. And I think being in charge of your own destiny is really wonderful, that control that you have when it's your business. It's something that you never get, that you're in-house and management makes silly decisions. And
why not make your own silly decisions? I make them every day.
Exactly. I was going to say that,
much more fun.
But back to being podcasting, do you think that having your podcast helps you with your work as a podcast strategist?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And I think by nature of how I've done it too, there are a million ways to enter the podcast market. You can get as much or as little support as you want. I unfortunately was forced into little support financially. So I had to, at some stage, learn to edit. So for full transparency, when I set up the podcast, I worked with an incredible organization called Pro Podcast Production, someone I worked with at Nova. And I told them my idea, and God, he was so encouraging and really got me past myself. And I said, I don't know how to set up a hosting platform. I don't know how to do any of that. And he's like, right, well, we'll do it for you. So I paid them to set the channel up for me. I paid a graphic designer to make my artwork. I had researched and bought microphones, and I did all that. And then I was paying them to edit my episodes. Originally, I was only going to do 6 episodes. It was going to be a 6-part series, and I'd see how I went. By episode 3, I was like, oh, well, that's life over. Like, this is what I do now. I'm in love with this. So, I was paying someone to edit it for me, and that became financially unviable very, very quickly because, like I said, unemployed and afraid. And, when you're building a business, it's not always possible to outsource in the first instance. So I had to go through a path of learning to edit myself, which, I'm the gray hair and the sweating and the swearing that comes from that process, not pleasant. But, I went through that. And so I got incredibly close to the content. I had to think about who I was speaking to. So I was finding, and I'm always finding the guests myself. I'm researching them. I'm supporting them through the experience of being interviewed as well, because many people that I speak to have never been interviewed before. So I want to make them feel really comfortable to share their journey with me. And, going through the process of actually recording and then editing, writing the show notes, promoting the thing, uploading it to the back end, because now I have my hosting platform myself. I've transferred that over, and even so far as to put ads into my own podcast and learning how to use a program that allows me to do that dynamically. So, these are just some of the elements I've had to learn through producing my own show. And that has made me such a better strategist, because I understand little nuances. Like, if you are going to have an interview-led podcast, there are a number of ways to do a great interview. You guys are fantastic interviewers, but there are a number of things that you have to do to make for a great interview. You cannot be hung up on not going on a tangent. You have to be supportive. You have to be able to manage yourself through conflict. you need to be able to stay present with the person you're interviewing, and all of these skills that I know now from being on the other side that I can share in that space and be like, great, we're going to do an interview podcast. All right, so when we're picking your host, these are the things they need to be primed for. These are the way you need to prep your guests so that they feel really comfortable. These are the sorts of overarching narrative themes that we're laddering up to in your questioning. So yeah, there's it's a very long way of saying it has been absolutely pivotal to my success as a branded podcast strategist. I wouldn't have had the ability I have to make ideas like I do without having that experience.
That's so true. And also, obviously, I follow you everywhere and I get so envious at your podcast marketing because it's so brilliant. It's so brilliant. And the way that you pluck out multiple things from episodes and the way that you promote that, I always look at it and I get extremely envious because we don't have time to do that with the Content Bite. And I know there are so many nuggets of gold in every episode that we could be, if we worked on it full time or had the time, that we could be doing, but I think you do it so brilliantly. It's like a masterclass in how to really market a podcast in the right way.
I am shook. That is such a generous compliment. Thank you.
True.
Because I feel like a failure every day in my marketing. So
you do it so well and so beautifully, and it's really well designed. And so I've thought that from the start, looking at your marketing. So that's one thing. And also I think that, like I was going to say, it probably gives those big brands that you're working with reassurance that you've got the chops to take on their projects because they can see how you do yours, and so it's like an ad for your skills to them in a way, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's so funny because I've started to realize recently that it has become that, it was this thing in and of itself. Like Unemployed and Afraid is my business. I am building it to be commercially viable. I'm attracting the right kind of partners that love small businesses as much as I do, that want to partner with me, and it's becoming its own business. But I didn't realize it was also becoming its own lead magnet in what I've evolved into, which, like I said, when I left media, I was like, I might go back to it, but it'll never be quite the same. And then I cracked it and I was like, nah, I'll do anything I can opposite, yoga, ceramics. And now I've come full circle back into this media forum. And I can see how it's sort of, driving
feeding
leads
into the other.
And a great podcast can do that. It can be a fantastic marketing tool either for how you speak and how you present, or for what you're promoting, if you're promoting a course or a class or something like that, as long as you're not just hammering home, here's what I do, and because an audience just isn't interested in that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's loads of ways as well. I could share lots of tools and learnings through pulling out the key points of an episode. It is through the editing process that I find them. And I've recently been playing with a couple of AI platforms that do this as well. So there are platforms that you can drop a whole episode into and it will pull out show notes for you and key themes. And it's funny, I do it manually and then I will do it in AI and I will look at the difference. And I would never just do the first one without, the second. Just it's interesting to see the difference in them. But, I think it does come from loving the content and being a little bit obsessed with it, being really close to it, but then using tools to enhance it as best you can. So I always look at the stuff that gets spit out and I'm like, nope, still not as good. I'm going back to my show notes.
It's really interesting. Like you say, getting really close to the content. Neither of us edit our episodes. So, and Lynne is actually far better than me at creating those transcripts and pulling out the episodes for the things that we do want to highlight in our headliner. And I try and do it via another app called Snipped, but I'm moving on to something else called Audiogram, which I think does it in a much more nicer branded way. But it's funny that you say that because you do, when you're so close to something that you're producing, I know that that's definitely something I lost when I started handing my interviews over to Otter to be transcribed. Because when you transcribe your own stuff, I almost was putting the story in my, together in my head because I was so close to it. Yeah. So I believe that is a little thing that's been lost by us using AI and, carving out a bit more time for ourselves. But you can still get there, but it's not quite the same.
So a lot of our audiences are journalists and content producers, and they might think about adding new skills to their arsenal. And that sort of goes back to what we're talking about, widening your offering and sort of evolving. Do you think that podcasting producing is something to look at? And what sort of work is out there?
I mean, absolutely. Podcasting it's a new media. it's still quote unquote new in terms of what else already exists. And so it's definitely worth looking into. Where it differs though, I mean, I think a lot of us have gone into the opportunity to create for social media, for example, and, start writing captions or reel scripts or things like that from a writing perspective. And I think where it differs is it's both an extra social media network for either a creator or a brand, but also completely different to that. You kind of can't really learn to write for podcasts generally, but you can learn about podcasts, and then you can find ways to write really impactful work for the podcast that you're partnering with, to make their key points known and the hooks fantastic, and really support a show to grow and get people engaged in listening. And there's the term producer. I use it more generally for the person that is on set, if that you're in a studio or online, you can, do that there. And they're sort of almost coaxing like the interview along or the story along. It depends what kind of podcast it is too. It could be, interview like we're doing now, or it could be more of a narrative podcast where you're weaving in, storytelling, sound design, in grabs from interviews, old grabs from, media headlines, things like that. These beautiful ABC podcasts that we just love. So, it could be like that. And so that requires, quite the skill to produce, because you've got to be quite passionate about sound and sound design. But like anything, there's opportunity out there to be part of the podcasting environment and seek opportunities to sit in the room, to intern, to, spend time engaging in the medium. And that's the big thing. I think I get a little bit almost sassy about this in LinkedIn, which I probably should pull back from time to time, but it is a medium that you need to love. You have to listen to podcasts you hate. You have to really understand the industry and where it's going, and know the difference between a production agency and a network, and know the difference between Joe Rogan and everybody else, and just really engage in the medium itself. But back more generally to your question, because I do love to go on a tangent. There are so many ways to work with a podcaster, whether it is, listening back to the episode and crafting really unique show notes that pull out key themes. And, the energy behind a human being doing this is always going to be more powerful than something that's done automatically. But you can run it through AI and get really strong themes, but then listen back to it and build on that, put the human energy behind it. So show notes are a fantastic way to get engaged in it, as long as you understand the podcast concept and what it's trying to achieve overall. Crafting strategies for podcasts, crafting ideas. I mean, that's what, a strategist, I make ideas for podcasts. That's basically what I do. But I also understand the podcast medium and environment. So I have the added value of how to market and, how to think about an audience, all those things as part of that. So, but, that is an opportunity, helping people craft a great concept. Think about what it's called, what its byline is. The show blurb is so important. I'm just having mine rewritten. I'm a writer. I love to write, but I have outsourced that to a creative writer because I am so close to the content. I just keep making it sound worse and worse and worse, in my opinion. So I've outsourced that to someone to creatively look at my show and write my blurb for me, so that an audience, when they land on my channel, goes, I know what that's about, and I know I'm going to love it in a very short space of time. So I mean, there's so much work, but you can be really creative in podcasting as well. I mean, there's surely so many roles that don't have a name or a title yet that you can, and that makes it hard, of course, as freelancers to say, I'm a this, employ me for this. But it also opens up a lot of opportunity.
Absolutely.
Tell me about the skills that you need to learn. Are there places you can learn some of these skills, or are most of the podcast producers and strategists, self-taught?
There's a few great podcast schools around. Rachel Corbett runs a fantastic one that can teach you. And it's sort of, most of them are marketed though at, so you want to start a podcast, So you have to just keep that in mind. I'll have my course soon, which is around how brands can build big podcasts for themselves. But also, if you're a person who just wants to learn about how to make podcast concepts, that's perfect. It just kind of depends. You just have to look at it from a different perspective, because it is still an evolving industry. Most of the education standpoints are targeted at either creators or I guess, brands in my perspective as well. But, I think there's a lot to be learned on the internet. You know, there's a lot there. All of the platforms that you can host podcasts on have fantastic blogs and, you know, educational series. I use Descript as my editing software, and they've got fantastic forums and things like that on podcasting as an industry. There's, you know, Pod News, you know, great subscription services that you can sign up to. I mean, honestly, I'll send you through some and to put into the show notes, some
That'd
really
be
great
great.
places you can go and just read and learn. But it's kind of, you know, how you can go to like do radio school. You know, we don't seem to really have that in a varied form yet. No one's really treating that, I've found anyway. I would love it if somebody has this and can put it in front of me. I would be really interested to look at it. But it doesn't really seem like anyone is just teaching you about podcasting generally, unless you're a creator.
I think Libsyn, we host with Libsyn, and they have a little sort of free course on how to do your own podcast, which is like right from the start. And I've recommended that to people because it talks about how it works. Because often you don't know the behind the scenes. Rachel and I have learned so much since doing this, which has made it easier then to work on branded podcasts. We've both done some branded podcasts because I think I've done all my learning by doing this. Yeah.
But you did that branded podcast. Was it for CSR, your branded podcast?
Yeah, I did.
It was quite lucrative, actually. That we wanted to ask about, you know, how you price your services for that sort of thing. But you did a lot of project managing on that project, didn't you?
I did. I did a branded podcast for CSR, who are one of my biggest clients. It was an extension of the work I did with them already. So I was already doing some case studies and blog posts with them. And then I added a podcast, and then I used the podcast transcripts to turn them into those sort of case studies and things. So the actual podcast did quite well for me. I can't remember how much I charged them, but it was sort of close to, I on charge things like the editing and some of the social media as well. But then I also bundled on extra things like podcast, you know, like case studies and everything from the scripts, and it worked really well for them. So I think I was making about sort of $1,000 an episode, maybe a bit more when you pulled it all together. But it was great because I used the skills that I've learned with this, but with a client I already knew pretty well.
Yeah,
I'd love to know, Kim, is that sort of comparable? Like, would you charge an hourly rate to work on a project with a brand? Or say that you were a journalist saying, you know, I'm a great interviewer. I'd like to be like hired to be a podcast interviewer on a branded podcast or something like that. How should you begin to price that kind of work?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I actually saw recently that, just as an aside, there seems to be a little, I call it little, and I don't mean that to be dismissive, but it's kind of like a groundswell union that's starting to get set up. And I think we'll see more of these start to pop up that talks about the rates that you could and should be charging as a podcast freelancer. So again, I'll make sure to send that through to you so you can put it in the show notes, because it does give some sort of hourly rates. But honestly, I looked at it and thought, wow, that's low. I would be charging a lot more than that, because it is a very niche skill set, you know, podcasting. There's a lot to know about it. So, you know, I think that's the big thing to remember is if you learn how to do it and you know how to do it, that's really valuable. So don't undercut yourself in that respect. Brands can, I mean, in terms of getting a podcast produced, not just brands, but, you know, influencers who want to pay for somebody else to kind of create and produce their podcast, or anybody else, you could be paying upwards of $5,000, $6,000, $10,000 for a podcast episode. It depends the scale. You know, some people are doing or just audio podcasts. Some people are doing audio and video podcasts, two very different things with two very different strategies behind them. It's really important to remember it's not always a great idea to just take your podcast and whack the video on. You know, it's a different experience for a user, but, you know, so these can be large scale. You can have deep sound design that requires more time of a sound designer or an editor. And yeah, so they can be, you know, quite exy, and clients will pay for a good quality product. In terms of my offering, in terms of branded podcast strategy, so I will work with someone one-on-one and like a half day or a full day rate. If someone just wants to run an idea by me, and I'll just brainstorm with them and, you know, we'll spitball a few ideas around, and I'll leave them thinking about what they're going to do next. I'll do a half day. I can go in and do a workshop in a full day and teach people as much as possible in that day about the landscape and about how to get to your idea with I guess a vision that we come out on the end of that with. If it's a brand, we've got a bit of a plan in place. Or I can come on in a retainer model and be retained for a project for a period of 6 weeks or longer to get something off the ground. So that's how I work it. I think if you're niching in on one specific area of podcasting, it comes into more that hourly rate. So if you're coming on as a creative writer for a project, you might say, yep, okay, it's a 12-part season. There's a lot of upfront we kind of have to do and learn and a lot of tweaks, so you might forecast it on 4 or 5 days worth of work at an 8-hour day for a season, and it's just an hourly rate here or there, so you can monitor bringing up and down. There's a number of ways that you can do it, and most production agencies will be outsourcing this element, so you can look around to all of the fantastic, and I work closely with the Peers Project. They're awesome. They're always producing great podcasts. There's loads of great production houses out there doing creator-led podcasts as well as branded, that you can connect with it and think about how you might come into their team in some way, shape or form. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Well, I do know that the one I did for CSR was fairly simple. It was low, sort of very low tech and everything. And I spoke to a lot of tradies. So we did a lot of stuff on Zoom, less technology. But I actually was talent on one for HCF when they did on parenting. And that they hired a studio that had a high profile host who was Jessica Rowe. And there was a lot of editing. So I think I did an hour and a half chat, and then they distilled it down into 20 minutes. Wow. A lot of editing, and it had to go through a lot of approval processes with HCF, because HCF also has some regulatory things that they want to be careful of. And so that obviously it's a whole different production than the one I did for CSR. And I can see that would take a lot of time, and they were really particular.
Yeah, that's fantastic. It's crazy to see how much you can distill out of an episode into that 20 minutes. But hosting is, a lucrative opportunity as well. I absolutely have made myself available as talent, quote unquote talent, always feels awkward to say, but host of a podcast and offering interview skills. I think, there's a number of ways you can do that too. You can be that sort of blind interviewer, where you tee people up for storytelling, but the listener doesn't hear your voice. And it's edited in such a way that you're just teeing up a person to tell a great story. And maybe it's top and tailed with, just a great intro from a host. Or you can be an active host, like you and I are doing, we're all doing now. And that gives another opportunity, because if you're someone with an audience or a bit of reach in a niche area, you can promote that as an opportunity and, use those skills to become talent, I guess.
It's definitely a great way to think laterally for journalists, particularly who have those interview skills and kind of parlay that into another income stream. So I really love that. Oh, but we have to get onto our digital tools, because I think we're running out of time. And I know that you will have so many as a podcaster. You mentioned something before that is the one tool that helps you edit, and you couldn't do anything without it. So tell us about that, and tell us about the other things that you would be lost without.
Oh, absolutely. Well, firstly, I don't record on Zoom anymore, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But Zoom was the thing. I do still love it, and I love it for its ease and its quality. So, and just, being able to chat with people. But I actually record now on Squadcast, which is a fantastic platform. What I love about that is I have the ability to see on the backstage, quote unquote, what my guests' audio inputs and outputs are. So sometimes, people who aren't, doing these recordings all the time, they jump on and it's chaos, and the AirPods are connecting, and then the blue, everything's like going haywire. So I can actually have that ability to see what their input and outputs are, so I can support them to feel comfortable and get really good audio quality. So I love that platform for that. And I then edit in Descript, and Squadcast and Descript are integrated, which is now why I switched from Zoom to Squadcast. And Descript is fantastic, honestly. I get my audio files, the WAV files, drag and drop them straight into Descript, and the transcript is created like that. It's there for me. And what Descript does is you can actually edit from the words, or you can edit from the audio file So you can actually highlight a word and delete the word, and it speaks to the audio in there, which is a nicer experience than highlighting over random little zigs and zags to find the word that you need to edit out.
Yes.
So if you highlight a word in the transcript, it will delete that from the audio.
Yes.
That's interesting.
So fun. And they've got some really great integrations. I'm not an audio engineer by any stretch. I have a very big appreciation for the scale you can go to in audio engineering, but just to get me started, there's a fantastic setting in Descript where you can just click studio sound and it does its work, and can take out some echo or take out a little bit of strange background noise and get it sounding a little bit better. So I love that as a start point. I do my final mastering of my episode in DaVinci, which is a little different. It's a little less intuitive, a little bit more manual, but I like that because I like certain things to cross over in certain ways and become a real audio nerd.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're probably my three can't live without. And then, Squarespace, of course, I've done some work with them recently, but, my podcast, it's really important to have a podcast website. As you guys know, you have a fantastic one. So I, host mine over there and put all my show notes and everything up there. But it makes it really enjoyable just to have like a nice tech stack. And I'd be pretty lost without all that.
Amazing.
Wow. It's so good. It's so many interesting bits and pieces, Kim. Make sure everybody checks out the show notes because we're going to mention all of those, and we do appreciate you sending us all those links.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So where can people find out about you and connect with you?
Well, of course, I would love it if you listened to Unemployed and Afraid on all of the podcast platforms. You can find there, follow, subscribe, rate, review, all the fun things we love to say and talk about in podcasting. Yes. And my strategy and other offerings in terms of workshops, one-on-one strategy, talent, speaking events, you can find all that info about me at goodsideofthebed.com.au. Good Side of the Bed is my internet alias.
All right, fair enough.
Oh my God, this has blown my mind. Thank you so much for
interesting.
coming on. It's just been the most interesting, amazing chat. We really appreciate having you on. And it's just been great also to kind of get to know you a bit at the summit and then be able to extend that conversation. It's just been great. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Much.
I think extending the conversation was always going to be the risk with the three of us on a podcast.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
been wonderful to chat.
Yeah,
Be it long.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, everybody. We will see you next week. And don't forget, you can find the show notes and find a bit more about what we've talked about and where you can connect with Kim.
Yeah, and I should say thanks again to our sponsors, rounded.com.au, because they're easy in accounting and invoicing software, and they're just made for Australian freelancers and sole traders. So go to rounded.com.au.
Bye.
Bye.